Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. All right, thank you. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center, to this meeting of the Cold War International History Project. My name is Mircea Munteanu. I'm the project associate here at the center. And I want to welcome you on behalf of the center and of Christian Osterman, who's traveling right now back to the United States. For those of you who don't know, the Cold War International History Project was established at the Woodrow Wilson Center in 1991 with the generous support of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. The project supports the full and prompt release of historical materials from governments from all sides of the Cold War and seeks to accelerate the process of integrating new sources, materials, and perspectives from the communist bloc with the historiography of the Cold War, which has been written over the past few decades largely using Western sources. It also seeks to transcend barriers of language, geography, and regional specialty to create new links among scholars interested in Cold War history. Among the activities undertaken by the project to promote the same are the periodic bulletin, publication of the bulletin, and other publications to disseminate new findings, views, and activities pertaining to Cold War history. As a matter of fact, the new issue of the bulletin, issue number 16, Inside China's Cold War, is now available. You can download it from the Cold War Project website at www.cwihp.org or from the Woodrow Wilson Center's main website. Aside from the publication of bulletins and working papers, we also organize international scholarly meetings, conferences, and, like today, seminars. The release of the Fru's Volume 39 completes it's part of the record of the Nixon and Ford administration on security in Europe. It continues the release of documentations by the Historian's Office at the Department of State on the two administrations, and it fits perfectly with recent events that the Cold War International History Project has organized or co-sponsored, including the discussion a few days ago of Jeremy Story's recent publication, Henry Kissinger and the American Century, as well as a conference we co-organized with our partners at the National Security Archive and our friends in Belgrade on the first follow-up meeting of CSE in Belgrade 1977. We have quite a few of our friends here today joining us on a panel to discuss the release of Fru's Volume 39. Right next to me is the editor of that volume, Doug Selvage. Doug is, well, as I said, is the editor of Fru's Volume 39, 1969 to 1976, European Security, and an assistant professor of history in the humanities and social sciences at the Department of Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Daytona Beach, Florida. He is also the principal investigator for a 2-year National Endowment for Humanities research grant, which is translating, editing, and annotating over 3,100 pages of Warsaw Pact documents. Can't wait to see those. Previously, Doug worked for 5 years as a historian in the Historian's Office at the US Department of State. His other publications include Fru's 1969-1976, volume number 29, Eastern Europe, Eastern Mediterranean, 1969 to 1972, co-edited with James E. Miller and Laurie Van Hook. The joint Russian-American volumes, Soviet-American Relations, The Detente Years, 1969 to 1972, co-edited with David Geyer, and numerous articles in the publications of the Cold War International History Project, the Parallel History Project, and PHP Partners. He is currently completing the final chapter of his book, The Warsaw Pact and the German Question, 1955 to 1970, Poland, the German Democratic Republic, and the Soviet Union, which I understand from Doug will be published in the Cold War International History Project series. Very much hope so. Also joining us is Dr. Edward Keefer, who's the general editor of the official Department of State Historical Documentary Series, The Foreign Relations of the United States, FRUS for short. He received his PhD from Michigan State University in 1974 after joining the Office of the Historian at the Department of State in 1973. He has been general editor of the Fru series since 2002 and is responsible for the organization, content, and production of the series. Before becoming general editor, he edited or co-edited 25 Fru's volumes, many of them on Vietnam or Southeast Asia. Dr. Keefer has published articles on the U.S. relations with East Asia, Nixon and Kissinger's foreign policy, and has contributed chapters to books on the Korean War and U.S. relations with East Asia. Right in the center, we have the commentator for today's talk, Dr. Svetlana Safranskaya. She is a research fellow at George Washington University National Security Archive, director of its cooperative projects with Russian archives and institutes, and editor of the Russian and East Bloc Archival Document Database. She earned her PhD in political science and international affairs in 1998 from Emory University and worked as a Hewlett Fellow at the Carter Presidential Center in Atlanta. While completing her PhD, she served as a research associate for several archive Cold War project joint efforts, including the Carter-Brezhnev project at the Brown University Watson Institute, as well as the End of the Cold War project at the National Security Archive. She's won several fellowships and awards during her graduate studies, including a prestigious dissertation fellowship from the Institute of Study of World Politics in Moscow, Russia. I think the way this is going to go is Dr. Keefer will be speaking briefly about the Fru series in general and about the idea behind it. Then we're going to let Doug speak about the volume itself, and then have Svetlana comment a little bit and add a little bit more background information and context. So, thank you.
Let me take this opportunity to plug the series, since as you probably all know, it's the oldest official documentary series on foreign relations. It was established in 1861 by Abraham Lincoln and Secretary of State Seward. And to date, we have published approximately 425 volumes. This is about 422 or 23. We just, so many we really don't always able to count them. This volume deals with the Nixon-Ford period, and it's one of 41 volumes that we're going to print in book form to cover the period 1969 to 1976. And in addition, we have 16 electronic-only volumes that are or will be published only on the Department of State website. Now, all of our print volumes, which are available for purchase at the government printing office, are also available for free downloading on the department's website, www.state.gov. And like e-volumes, they could be downloaded at no charge. So far, we've released 16 print volumes and 8 electronic volumes for the Nixon-Ford administrations. The remaining 33 volumes are in declassification or final editing stages. Now, this volume was ably collected, selected, and edited by Doug Selvage, and it's a departure from the traditional foreign relations coverage of a topic. For starters, it covers an 8-year span, and as you can see by the size of the volume, it does it quite effectively. It takes a topical approach to documenting U.S. relations with Europe by focusing on the broad general theme of European security. More specifically, it documents the successful U.S. and Soviet efforts to achieve an agreement on security and cooperation in Europe along with the NATO allies. And it also focuses on the attempt to reduce NATO and Warsaw Pact forces in Europe. Now, the main two mechanisms for these efforts were the consultations with the allies in the Soviet Union on the conference on security and cooperation in Europe, which, of course, as you probably all know, eventually resulted in the Helsinki Accords. The second major mechanism were the discussions and negotiations on mutual and balanced force reductions in Europe, which, of course, were not resolved until after the Ford administration left office. The emphasis of this volume is on high-level policy decisions usually by Presidents Nixon and Ford and Henry Kissinger, and high-level negotiations and consultations, mostly by Henry Kissinger. Because of its focus, the volume contains an extraordinary number of high-level memorandum of conversations, in addition to the usual records of NSC and NSC subgroup meetings, internal memorandum of the White House staff, intelligence assessments, Department of State memorandum, and the Department of State cables. An example that I like to tell of the breadth of the memorandum of conversations in this volume is that there are two, not one, but two memorandum of conversations between Henry Kissinger and the Luxembourg Prime Minister, Gaston Thorn, which I think is the most coverage we've ever given to Luxembourg in any foreign relations volumes that I'm aware of.
Right.
So Doug has an absolute first in this volume. While the documentation in the volume is mostly traditional, there are some transcripts of Nixon presidential tape recordings, and there are a number of transcripts of Kissinger and Alexander Haig's telephone conversations. And I think these provide a kind of informal and sometimes very revealing context to the otherwise more formal documentation that you find in the volume. And I'll just quote from one conversation between Nixon and Haig on September 2nd, 1972, and hope that you guys aren't going to quote from it too, when Nixon tells Haig that, quote, the European Security Council, he meant the European Security Conference, as you know, I'm not a damn bit interested in it. And Nixon then goes on to say that the ESC, the European Security Council, is William Rogers, Secretary of State William Rogers, and Nixon uses the word bag, his bag, and he doesn't want to talk about CS, the conference with it to Rogers. In truth, neither Nixon nor Kissinger thought that the CSE process would amount to much, as Kissinger continually told the Russians. The United States was dragged along by its European allies, who, rightly as it turned out, saw the value in an agreement with the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact on security and cooperation in Europe. Now, I don't want to steal any more of the thunder from the other speakers, but let me conclude by saying that this volume was a difficult and challenging one, and Doug Selvage was clearly up to the challenge. I'd like to commend him for his selection, his annotation, his informative and extensive editorial notes that carry the story forward, and for his general organization of the volume in which he effectively weaved the two stories of CSCE and MBFR. And I also want to commend him for the fact that he was able to really include a huge amount of material over an 8-year period in a relatively concise volume. So, Doug, great job.
We're going to start now with Doug, just a brief presentation of the volume and then your research and so on, and then have some comments from Svetlana, and then open it up for discussions.
Okay. This was quite a challenge to put together. The parameters I had were 8 years of documentation. I was supposed to complete the volume in a year and a half. Actually, it was 2 years maybe, or a little over 2. 1,400 pages. I think I went a little bit over 1,400 manuscript pages. And also I had double the archives to go to because I was covering 2 different administrations. So I had to use the Nixon presidential materials, the Ford presidential materials, all of the archives. It's basically double the normal Fruce volume in terms of things to look at. And the other major problem was that CSCE and MBFR, the Council on Security, Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, and these mutual balanced force reduction talks, they were talked about everywhere and nowhere. It's not like you would find a few files every now and then in different collections where it said CSCE or where it said MBFR, but for the most part, especially since it wasn't a top priority for the Nixon administration, or the Ford administration for that matter, except when they finally had to defend it, most of this would end up in other areas, for example, bilateral conversations. So that's why you end up, for example, with the MIMCONs from the Luxembourger foreign minister, is because when they sat down to talk, Kissinger and Thorn, that was what they talked about. They actually talked about CSCE. Or in many cases, there would be MIMCONs between the Americans and the French, or Kissinger and the Soviets, or Kissinger and the British, and they talked about 8 different topics, but they also spoke to some extent about CSCE. And in fact, most of the negotiations about CSE, at least at the high level, as far as the administration was concerned, was bilateral, even though you had this delegation off in Geneva negotiating on the agreement. In terms of the volume, in terms of the overall attitude of both the Nixon and Ford administrations towards CSCE, I think probably the best summary comes from Kissinger when he's talking to the cabinet on August 8th, 1975. This is just after the Helsinki conference. And Kissinger says point blank, CSCE was never an element of U.S. foreign policy. We never pushed it and stayed a half step behind our allies all through the process. But we didn't want to break with our allies or confront the Soviets on it. So although later on, certainly he repeats this sentiment in the first and second volume of his memoirs, by the third volume of his memoirs, after the Soviet Union has collapsed and after some people credited Basket 3, the human rights provisions of CSCE with the downfall of the Soviet Empire, then he proudly claims it. Or if you look at the volume itself, he really has all of these disparaging remarks about CSC until he actually has to defend it. When they actually, Ford actually goes to the conference and he asks to actually explain why the U.S. did this or, went to this conference, then he defends it. And later on, he portrays that as, well, I supported it. And it's more like he was defending the Ford administration. So I know some scholars claim that at some point in 1974-75, Kissinger suddenly had an epiphany and realized that, some aspects of CSCE would be useful for the U.S., like peaceful change of borders or the provisions on military maneuvers, notification on military maneuvers, or something about human rights. But as far as the documents show, or at least as I read the documents, he never really did have the epiphany. It was only after the fact that when he had to defend it that he had this epiphany. In terms of the volume itself, I think the first part of the volume, even the whole period from 1969 to 72, I named the first chapter Bureaucratic Steamroller. And this comes from Helmut Sonnenfeld, who was Kissinger's main assistant on European affairs. And this was before the European Security Conference started, when the Soviets first proposed it. And Sonnenfeld said, this European Security Conference idea is a bureaucratic steamroller. They keep talking about it in the NATO bureaucracy. They keep talking about it in the State Department bureaucracy. And basically, we need to do something to get control of this situation to slow it down as much as we can, because it's not really in our interests. And Ted already mentioned what Nixon had to say about it. We're not a damn bit interested in it. At another point, he said, when you have European security, we can damn near forget NATO. He saw it as a Soviet ploy, basically, to break up NATO and replace it with the European Security Conference, which to some extent was a correct analysis of the Soviet intentions. And so their main concern from 69 to 72 was to stop this from getting off the ground, or at least to slow it down. And they realized they couldn't do it by basically just saying no, because so many of the allies supported the idea. So the main thing was to make sure that it had clear goals to try to slow down the consultative process, and maybe at least to get something for it, right? If going back to the idea of linkage, at some point we have to go along with this European Security Conference idea. Well, let's get something that we really want out of the Soviets from this, because this is just not in our interest. The issue of mutual and balanced force reduction talks, or conventional force reductions in Europe, that really became a hot issue in 1971. And in this, again, the Nixon administration wanted to slow down talks on this. They were afraid it would lead to talk in Europe of, withdrawing lots of U.S. forces from Europe, or irresponsible proposals to get rid of, all weapons in Europe or something like that. But they did consider the idea of these talks on balanced force reductions to be potentially useful, only because at home you had the Mansfield Amendment. Senator Mike Mansfield kept proposing, well, we're having the Vietnam War, we're spending all this money on defense. Why don't we just withdraw our troops from Europe? Why are we paying for Europe's defense? And in order to stop the Mansfield Amendment, the Nixon administration decides, well, it would actually be good to at least get some talks rolling on mutual and balanced force reductions, so when Congress keeps bringing this up, we can say, well, why engage in unilateral reductions when we have these talks potentially we can have with the Soviets where they'll also reduce their forces? So for the Nixon administration, really MBFR had very much an instrumental use, namely killing the Mansfield Amendment. And that's why they kept it rolling. And actually, MBFR keeps going on. It goes on through the Carter administration. It goes on through the Reagan administration. Eventually, it ceases at some point, I think, under Reagan. And then it reconvenes as the Conference on Conventional Forces in Europe. And they actually do reach an agreement in 1991, isn't it? So these go on forever, these negotiations, which is actually sort of what Nixon wanted. Because as long as the negotiations go on, there will be no unilateral U.S. troop cuts in Europe. Well, finally, they did agree to the idea of a European Security Conference at the Moscow Summit in May of 1972. They had already linked the idea with the agreement on Berlin. The Soviets had basically reached an agreement with the West about Berlin. And also, they sought to trade it for talks on mutual and balanced force reduction. So at the Moscow Summit, in return for the fact the Soviets agreed to the MBFR talks, which were important for killing the Mansfield Amendment, the Nixon administration says, okay, we agree in principle to this idea of holding this European Security Conference. And after the Moscow Summit in May of 1972, they linked the two issues basically, well, if you want us to agree on a date certain to start CSCE talks, the Soviets need to agree on a date certain to start MBFR talks. And this goes on for a while, but eventually they do agree to a date for the MBFR talks. Well, this brings me to the second point I wanted to make, and the first point is basically that the Nixon administration wasn't interested in CSCE at all. It's just something they had to manage and deal with. But the second aspect is linkage. And again, this shows how relatively unimportant CSCE was for the Nixon administration, because they kept trading it for different things. First, in a sense, they trade it for a Berlin Agreement by saying to the Soviets, look, we're not going to agree to a European Security Conference until an agreement's reached on Berlin. Then they traded it again for MBFR, saying, well, if you want us to start CSCE talks, then you have to agree to start MBFR talks. And later on, Kissinger portrays agreeing to CSCE or a summit-level conclusion to CSCE as basically a bone to throw to the Soviet dog in return for the fact that they were kicked out of the Middle East. During the October 1973 war, Kissinger told the U.S. negotiators working on CSCE in Geneva to slow down the talks, to show the Soviets, as long as there were these problems in the Middle East, as long as the Soviets were misbehaving in the Middle East, that, well, there's a linkage between that and the European Security Conference. Well, the answer comes back from Geneva saying, well, we've slowed things down, but since things were going so slowly already, we're not even sure if the Soviets noticed that we slowed things down. In fact, and by the end of October of 1973, after things were not going so well in terms of Soviet interests in the Middle East, Kissinger basically told his staff, this is Secretary of State Kissinger talking to his staff, that we should push for some sort of compromise on CSCE with the Soviets, since they've lost out in the Middle East. And in March of 74, he said, we basically need to give the Soviets something. And there's an interesting quotation here from Kissinger when he's talking to his staff. And this is what he has to say about the Middle East and CSCE. Just a moment. We can't be sons of a bitches everywhere. We have to show the Russians they're getting something out of détente. I'm looking for things to give them that don't cost us anything. We have screwed them at every turn. Can you imagine what the Jacksons are saying in the Soviet Union about Vietnam, the Middle East, the wheat deal, basically cancellation of the Soviet grain deal, and MBFR? We have been softening up the West for the Soviets, and they have discovered that it is possible for Western public opinion to be both for peace and anti-communist. The Soviets are totally stymied everywhere, and I'm afraid if we can't give them something, there's going to be an explosion. And the thing you could give to the Soviets is the CSCE, basically let them have their conference, let them have their little demonstration, their conference, let Brezhnev do his thing at CSCE, and we've gained so much already. If we don't give them something, who knows what the Soviets might do. So it's interesting that you could almost call that a reverse linkage on Kissinger, where he's saying, well, we've really done well in dealing with the Soviets. In fact, maybe we've done too well. Maybe they'll give up on détente. So why don't we just throw them this bone on CSCE? Well, this brings us to the third interesting aspect, I think, of all this, and that is the conflict between the U.S. and its NATO allies. Because although Kissinger is willing to throw the CSCE bone to the Soviet dog, the West European allies, they actually consider the CSCE to be important, especially Basket 3, which deals with human rights. And so there's this ongoing friction between the United States and its NATO allies about how to proceed at CSCE. There was also a debate on MBFR as well. At the beginning of the MBFR talks, there was this big debate between the U.S. and its European allies about whether to include Hungary in the Soviet troop totals. And basically the Soviets said, well, we really don't want to include Hungary. If you're going to include Hungary, we want to include Italy. And that was significant for the United States because, of course, there are all the naval bases in Italy. There's a Mediterranean fleet. And so the Nixon administration really doesn't want to include Italy in any sort of force reduction talks. And so pretty much the agreement, if you will, behind the scenes between the U.S. and the Soviet Union is, well, Kissinger doesn't want to raise Italy, so the U.S. isn't going to raise Hungary. But then the West European allies, especially Great Britain, say, well, actually, Hungary is strategically important, and we definitely have to talk about bring Hungary into the MBFR talks. And so there's this whole dispute going back and forth. This is when Luxembourg gets involved. This is when the British get involved. And by the end of it, the British back down and say, fine, we don't have to include Hungary, but there are a lot of bitter feelings all around. And at one point, Kissinger accuses the British of trying to organize NATO on an anti-American basis, that basically they're trying to be the spokesman against U.S. interests inside of the EU. And he uses this sort of talk on different occasions about the French and the Year of Europe, but in this case it's the British whom he accuses of trying to organize the European allies against U.S. interests. But the main conflict between the Europeans and the U.S. was over Basket 3. And basically, Kissinger didn't consider the human rights provisions of CSCE that important. And what's interesting in the volume is it documents thoroughly that no matter what audience Kissinger was talking to, he basically said the same thing, that it really doesn't mean anything. For example, he told his staff at the State Department basically what he later told the Soviets about it. It's a pretty good quote here. If I understand the Soviet proposition, it is that they are willing to agree to concrete improvements of what we call human contacts if we are willing to agree to a statement that says we are not interfering with their domestic legislation. Basically, the Soviets said, fine, we might be willing to sell off on some of these human rights things that the West keeps demanding if you basically say, though, that existing legislation is not affected. And the West European attitude was, well, that means basically they're negating all the human rights provisions. But Kissinger is saying, well, can't we just go along with this on some level? He says, either these changes in human contacts are going to come about or they are not. If they are going to come about, the Soviets, don't need an excuse. They just won't come about. They want to be able to say that what they did as an exercise of their own sovereignty rather than foreigners telling them what their domestic legislation should be. Because I don't believe that a bunch of revolutionaries who managed to cling to power for 50 years are going to be euchred out of it by the sort of people we have got negotiating at the European Security Conference through an oversight. That basically, no matter what they agree to at this European Security Conference, they're going to make a bit of difference because the Soviets know one thing, and that's how to maintain power. Later on, he says similar things to Gromyko, the Soviet foreign minister. He says similar things to the West European allies. When Ford becomes president after Nixon's resignation, Kissinger calls Basket 3 a grandstand play to the left. Later on, in May of 1975, just before the actual Helsinki conference, he tells Ford that these issues of human contacts are just a total fraud. So he's very consistent in saying, later at one point he calls it the Basket 3 crap. What's this Basket 3 crap about? And whenever he goes to meetings, he almost takes pride in telling his staff, I don't know what all this Basket 3 stuff is about. Can you explain it again? Or he really makes clear that he could care less about it. He also mentions something about a Dutch cabaret. I guess I'll leave that for Svetlana. In the conference itself, he really makes fun of it. For example, he liked to joke about the fact that he was hoping that Princess Grace would show up to the conference. One interesting document I found was when he was actually talking to the Syrian foreign minister. Sometimes they talk to other countries about, different regions. And basically, Kissinger said to the Syrian foreign minister, "I had my eyes on Princess Grace's daughter myself." And the Syrian foreign minister said, "If European security could be achieved at this level, it would be good." Laughter. Kissinger, "If I were your president, I wouldn't worry about the European Security Conference. If it achieves security, it will be an accident." And then the Syrian foreign minister says, "European security is no longer important to the rest of the world. The powers now are fifth-rate powers. The countries that caused World War I have lost influence even on the continent. European security no longer has world dimensions." And Kissinger says, exactly. So he's not even sure that the conference itself is really that important. Now, he does get involved with Basket 3 later on, Kissinger does, when he realizes in terms of giving the Soviets something for détente, letting them have their CSCE, he begins to slowly sort of poke into this issue of Basket 3. Is there something that the Nixon administration can do in the spring of 1974 to start moving things along? And what he ends up coming up with is he and Gromyko get together and they work out a compromise on language about this issue of domestic legislation. And they come up with this idea of having a country X float this compromise because the U.S. doesn't want to take credit for this proposal because it'll get into trouble with the West European allies. The Soviets are afraid if they present it, the West Europeans will just knock it down. So they decide that country X is Finland, that Finland can, bring forth this compromise on human contacts on Basket 3 that basically the U.S. and the Soviet Union have put together and presented to the conference. And actually, Finland does modify it a little bit and presents to the conference, again, to show that Finland is sovereign. It does modify it somewhat, but basically it's a U.S.-Soviet compromise. And right away, the West Europeans figure out, yeah, it's the U.S. and the Soviets behind this. It talks about, instead of laws and customs, that all of the provisions about human rights should be in accordance with the existing legislative and regulatory systems of each country involved. This doesn't go over with the West Europeans. They say, well, maybe we'll agree to some compromise on this language, but first we have to have the specific provisions on human rights. What does this CSCE Final Act, what will it guarantee in terms of human rights? And again, Kissinger gets involved. In July of '74, he begins to push NATO to come up with a study, Minimal Acceptable Results, at the European Security Conference. Basically, he says the West Europeans keep bringing up all these proposals on human rights. Why don't we just sit down and say, what's the minimal acceptable results? And again, the West European allies balk. They say, we don't want to agree to this. In fact, the report from the negotiations themselves is that the West European allies were bitter and resentful that the U.S. was pressuring them to limit the human rights provisions. And eventually what ends up happening is they read off the provisions of the conference one by one. The Soviets have to vote them down one by one. And it's actually the French that begin to negotiate privately with the Soviets about the human rights provisions. And it's not until May of 1975 that really the U.S. and its NATO allies reach a allied global initiative on Basket 3 listing exactly what it is they all want. Right? But it takes these negotiations between the West Europeans and the Soviets first. Now, in terms of what the U.S. role was in the conclusion of the conference, certainly Kissinger's push for compromise on human rights, although it wasn't fruitful at the beginning, arguably it did get the West Europeans to go directly to the Soviets and try to work something out. He also played a role in this language on peaceful change of borders, which was important to West Germany, which wanted to keep the issue of German unification open, especially since CSCE provided for de facto recognition of existing borders in Europe. And also Kissinger helped work out a compromise on military maneuvers, 300 kilometers from the common border as opposed to 250. There are all these debates about numbers. He does play a role in reaching compromises on those. But clearly, all the evidence shows that as far as Kissinger was concerned, the European Security Conference was something to get over with. In fact, already in 71 or 72, he's saying, basically, let's have some banal conference with some general declarations, get it over with quickly to show how unimportant it really is. And it ends up dragging out to 1975, and even at the end, his position is the same. Basically, this is pretty much meaningless, but we have to do this because the Soviets, because we're allies, we have to come to some sort of arrangement. We need to give the Soviets something after kicking them out of the Middle East, after we've gotten all these other things in terms of linkage from the Soviets. We have to agree to this conference finally. And it really wasn't until the conference was over that you see Kissinger defending the conference when it becomes an issue in U.S. domestic politics, when Ford's under attack for going to Helsinki. Then he starts talking about all the advantages of CSCE. So in conclusion, I guess I would say that Kissinger's position on CSCE was consistent throughout. It's only after Ford was attacked about CSCE that really he changed his position, because he actually had to defend the actual CSCE.
First of all, I would like to thank my co-panelists for this terrific volume. It's really amazing, the documents they put together, and we were all waiting for them for such a long time. It's been our interest, the European Security Conference of the National Security Archive, for several years, and thanks to Max, we were able to do it beginning from 2003 in Florence. Nice place. And now I would like, there is very little really that I can add to what Doug said about the documents. What I would like to do is to give a little bit of context on the Soviet side, because I think that this volume really helps us, moves us closer to answer most interesting puzzles about the European security process, the Soviet interests, the expectations, and what the Soviets actually got as a result of the Helsinki process. And a couple of issues that I would like to mention, I think, really got a lot of evidence in the volume. First of all, the Soviet expectations and what the Soviets wanted to get out of the process are expressed very early on in 1969, when the first documents here, the first memorandum of conversations between Kissinger and Dobrynin, presented in this volume. They show that the conversation from the very beginning is very direct and open, and the Soviets make very explicit statements about, we want the inviolability of borders. We want the acceptance of post-war borders, and only as a second tier of interests, economic contacts and trade. And from the very beginning, as Doug says, Kissinger is very consistent, telling Gromyko that it's really not one of big U.S. interests to get involved in this European conference, because no particular issues are decided at big conferences, and they would rather work on big issues in U.S.-Soviet relations and reach decisions bilaterally. However, for the Soviets at that time, the European security process is the most important issue. And you can see that during the very first meeting of Kissinger to Moscow, and then the first summit, that becomes one of the major issues. And that issue is tied with Brezhnev's perception of his own role as opening a new era, of promoting détente, of being the peacemaker. So it's really very integral to his image, to his even domestic position as the promoter of détente, and also to what he genuinely wants to achieve, which is peace. He finds very willing partners in Nixon and Kissinger, and you can see from the very first meetings that the comfort during those negotiations is actually very, very impressive. They are talking quite openly. They find a lot of shared interests, and Even though, yes, the long-term goal of the Soviet Union is dissolution of the blocs, weakening of NATO in Europe, but that is a very long-term goal. And actually, if you look at the Soviet domestic discussions of CSC, they don't say we want to immediately dissolve the blocs. They say this is a very long-term perspective. Yes, we will weaken NATO in Europe, but the main goal is to reach an international agreement that would confirm that the borders in Europe are final and the Soviet status as a great power in Europe. So that is the one interesting puzzle that people from both countries looked at, and I'm sure from other countries too. Why was it so easy for the Soviets and Americans to suddenly make this very early breakthrough in arms control? Because they found a lot of similar interests, but also I think, and that's what the documents show very well, a similarity of styles between Brezhnev and Gromyko and Kissinger and Nixon. And in the very first meeting, the very first half an hour of his visit to Moscow in April '72, Nixon raises the question of secrecy. And he even suggests that, well, first jokingly, but then more and more seriously, should we just destroy our foreign offices? Let's burn our foreign offices. And Brezhnev completely agrees with him. Says, yeah, let's burn them. And then Kissinger goes on and wants to make sure that everything that is said here is between them. He assures Brezhnev that nothing that is said here he's going to tell to his State Department. And Brezhnev says it's between us. So then Kissinger goes on and says, well, in terms of burning my foreign office, I can assure you I am much further ahead than you. So and then suddenly it really clicks, and you can see how then very restrictive, very secretive kind of conspiracy aware mode of decision making is something that both the Americans and the Russians find themselves very comfortable with. That sets the stage for negotiating the CSC itself, because I think the importance of this very early understanding and this very early comfort, of course combined with the back channel between Kissinger and Dobrynin, is one of the main conditions that US and Soviets could negotiate CSC. And you could see it throughout during the conversations between especially Kissinger and Gromyko, Kissinger and Dobrynin, and during the summits. Then I come to the most interesting puzzle, of course, and Doug mentioned it before. I think the most interesting part of this volume for me was the basket 3 section, because it shows, really gives you a lot of evidence to answer the question, why did the Soviets agree to include basket 3? And if you just looked at the Soviet sources, then what you see is that Gromyko is a very unlikely proponent of CSC and even basket 3 domestically. When they presented to the Politburo, some Politburo members are very strongly against the whole idea, but especially of including basket 3. Suslov was, of course, the main opponent. And yet Brezhnev and Gromyko especially, assures the Politburo that there's nothing to worry about. There's nothing to worry about. So if you only look at the Soviet sources, you would think, why would Gromyko say something like this? Isn't it very short-sighted? But these documents provide evidence that no, he was not short-sighted. He was reassured numerous times, again and again and again, by Kissinger, very directly, very explicitly, that the United States will not do anything that would embarrass the Soviet Union, that the United States had no interest in the third basket, and that mainly the United States did not expect the Soviet Union to make any changes as a result of the third basket. The conversations generally, the issue of the third basket really comes up in the spring of 1974, as Doug said. But even before that, already in 72, you could see Kissinger, when he's speaking with the Soviets, being very dismissive of human rights. And that helps to set up this general atmosphere. In Moscow, in March 24, I guess this is everybody's favorite quote, Gromyko compares the third basket substance to a possibility that the Dutch would like to open a cabaret in Moscow, and the Soviet Union should agree to that. And he says that basket 3 is actually a huge pile of paper, and it's all unhelpful, and it's all confusing. It's the rubbish. And Kissinger, to that, says, I understand your point about basket 3. It has two aspects. One is to relate it to the principles, and the second is to give it some content. Some of the Europeans think that for domestic reasons, they have to give some content to basket 3. You and I discussed once that if we can establish a relationship to domestic legislation, meaning that domestic legislation would supersede any particular provisions of basket 3, you could consider some content for basket 3. I think that with goodwill on both sides, this is a solvable problem. The United States will use its influence not to embarrass the Soviet Union or raise provocative issues. What's interesting is that later in conversations with Gromyko, Kissinger refers to basket 3 as the Dutch cabaret business, which is, an interesting metaphor there. So then they reach this level of comfort where Gromyko actually asks Kissinger to put pressure on the European allies to water down the content of basket 3. And Kissinger reacts with full understanding, telling Gromyko something like this, for example, on May 7, 1974, as far as the substance of basket 3, the United States has never pressed you on it. I would not even know what it would look like. We have never even submitted a paper on it. Have we, Kornienko, his deputy foreign minister? And so then, again, Kissinger, in the same conversation, he says, I have never read it. I don't know what's in it. It's unimportant. You should not take it seriously. You will not be pressured. And in the end of another conversation, which is actually... the same conversation, Gromyko complains again to Kissinger, saying about the third basket, the question of peace and war is reduced to Mr. Smith should marry Mrs. Brown and should be allowed to meet and complete it in a specified period of time. The question of war and peace, Kissinger, you have proved your ability to stay in control of your country for 60 years. So essentially Kissinger is promising the Soviets that the United States will not take basket 3 seriously, that it is not a U.S. position, that they could go ahead and sign it without any worries of what will happen. However, somebody in the Soviet Union saw what might happen with this basket specifically. The director of Foreign Intelligence Department of the KGB, Nikolai Leonov, pointed out later that the Soviet Union, as a result of including basket 3, lost on all the points. The borders were altered when Germany was unified. The hopes for trade expansion did not bring the expected fruits, Jackson-Vanik Amendment. And the only true result of the Helsinki Agreement for the USSR was the expansive growth of human rights movements in all the socialist countries, which eventually undermined the regimes and directly contributed to their collapse. And the third and last point I would like to make, I think what these documents also show very helpfully is that the success story of détente is not completely a success story if looked at from the Soviet side. What the documents show is that it's a story of high hopes and frustrations on the Soviet side. We begin with very, very hopeful dialogue where the Soviets pressure the United States to go deeper and deeper for bilateral agreements, on such agreements as mutual cooperation on conflict resolution, especially in the third world, on no first use of nuclear weapons, especially on cooperation on the Middle East. And Brezhnev, when he comes to Washington and then to San Clemente, he tries to warn Nixon of an impending war in the Middle East, and he is very emotionally suggesting that if that conflict was coming, that they want to put pressure on their allies and deal with it bilaterally to bring about a negotiated solution. So Brezhnev comes into this relationship thinking he found a real partner in Nixon and Kissinger. He believes that real breakthroughs in arms control in Middle East and general conflict resolution are possible. And yet on each of them, and you can see it throughout the documents, more and more frustration is shown on the Soviet side. First of all, it's the frustration with complete failure in cooperation on the Middle East. Secondly, the Soviet Union still, even in '74, sees the United States as playing the China card, and Brezhnev is very concerned about the possibility of secret military agreements between the United States and China. There is a real lack of progress on SALT, which was very hopeful in 1972. There is really this lapsing period between 72 and Vladivostok. There is some movement in Vladivostok, but then it's too late and Brezhnev is too old and sick. And I think one of the main points for Brezhnev and the Soviets generally that showed that this success story is not completely successful is the Prevention of Nuclear War Agreement, which Brezhnev thought would be the agreement on no first use, which is achieved in 1973, and yet it doesn't really mean anything for the United States. The Soviet Union is trying to pump it up in the beginning, but then realizes that there is really no realistic or no institutionalizing of that agreement in real life. So I think that is also another interesting story that you can see in this volume, the high hopes for détente and then the frustration on the Russian side. If you read Kissinger, of course, you would think that détente was an incredibly successful foreign policy on the U.S. part, but it's not exactly how it looks on the Soviet side. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for this fascinating discussion. We're going to open it up for questions right now, so if you could just please wait for the microphone to get to you and ID yourself, that'd be great. Back there.
Hi, I'm Don Wolfensberger with the Congress Project here at the Wilson Center. Svetlana mentioned in passing the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. I'm just wondering what kind of reaction we were getting, from Kissinger at the time. I mean, this came in with the 1974 Trade Act at the very time this was all happening. It was pushed by, of course, Scoop Jackson in the Congress and others, where there was this concern about the immigration of Soviet Jews. And I'm just wondering how he's explaining this going on to the Soviets.
Actually, there's more of this probably there's a forthcoming volume in the Soviet Union, 72 to 6.
Yeah.
7? Yeah.
4.
72 to 4, yeah, and there's definitely a lot of material in that. But basically, what I found in terms of Kissinger's reaction to all of that, his attitude was that this is very unhelpful because it was part of the package, it was linked to other things. And by not approving MFN status for the Soviet Union without these Jackson-Vanik provisions, it was undermining his policy of linkage on other issues. And moreover, he claimed that he could get more progress in terms of human rights cases, in terms of getting the Soviets to agree to permit more Jews to immigrate through quiet diplomacy. Basically, by making it such a high-profile issue, this was undermining the possibility for Jews to immigrate. And sort of the ironic thing about all of this is there's a shift between the U.S. and Western Europe. And if we're talking about leading up to this, CSE conference in 1975, it's the West Europeans who are pushing the human rights provisions. And Kissinger basically disagrees with that. That's not how change is going to come about. Change comes about between states. In the traditional realist paradigm, that quiet diplomacy is the best way to deal with issues like Soviet Jews. But after CSE, when you have the Carter and Reagan administrations coming into power, they're the ones who start really hammering on Basket 3, and they sort of break, as far as Brezhnev is concerned, the sort of U.S. deal he had with Kissinger where the U.S. wouldn't embarrass them with Basket 3. They're the ones hammering on it and saying, well, you need to follow the human rights provisions of CSCE. And in many cases, the West Europeans are saying, well, you're going too far. Quiet diplomacy is better. So later on, there's this shift in terms of policy.
Koshko?
Hello, yes. I'm Małgorzata Gnańska from the George Washington University, PhD candidate in history. And I was wondering, Svetlana just mentioned that Brezhnev was really afraid of the China card. And from my own research, I know that in the early 1970s, the Chinese are really warming up to Western Europe, to Eastern Europe, and even the Poles are really afraid of the Chinese meddling in the CSCE. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on what the Americans are telling the Chinese about the CSCE, and if that is even in the volume or in the documents that you found.
What the Americans
Thank
are
you.
telling the Chinese, I don't think I really can comment on that. I did not see it in the documents. Maybe Doug.
Yeah, there aren't many documents about it in the volume, but basically the Chinese, whenever they talk with Kissinger, to the extent they bring up CSCE, they say, this is a bad deal. Why are you doing this? This is terrible. You're just, handing the Soviets Europe. Why are you doing this? And they're the greatest opponents to CSCE. And actually there are some documents in here later on when, after CSCE, when there's some very revealing talks between Kissinger and the Japanese foreign minister, because the Soviets are starting to propose a similar conference for Asia, and the Japanese are very worried about it, and Kissinger says, don't worry, we're not going to do it in Asia. But certainly the Chinese, they hate CSCE and they hate MBFR. It's like, well, why are you talking about reducing forces in Europe? You know where they're going to put those forces at, right along the Sino-Soviet border. So we hate MBFR. Why are you guys doing that? That's sort of, the Chinese are very clear about this.
They're actually telling the same thing to the Romanians as well.
Yeah.
The Chinese are.
Thank you, Frank Fletcher. Even what we might look at as relatively small concessions or whatever usually are always linked to things, and there were negotiations. And I would mention two things, one of which I can't be sure of, but one is rather visible. The Soviet embassy, the location, the new location, that was vehemently opposed by the National Security Agency because of detailed information and studies they had that would prove that that location up on that hill would open up tremendous signals intelligence collection possibilities for the Soviets. But anyway, the second issue would be the release of Cardinal Mindszenty from the American embassy. He was held there. He was freed by he was imprisoned by the Hungarians. He was released in '56 during the uprising. He was freed by the people involved in the uprising, and then he had to take refuge in the American embassy. And I never thought that would ever change, and then he's released, and I wonder if anyone knows, were there some secret negotiations?
We dealt with this in the volume on Eastern Europe, 69 to 72, that I worked on, and Mindszenty, I forget the exact year that he ended up being released, but the Hungarians wanted to normalize relations with the West, especially with the United States. And basically the U.S. ambassador to Hungary, I forget his name, I hate to say, but he negotiated an agreement where Mindszenty, even though the Hungarians at one point were willing to let him go, he said he was unwilling to go into exile, and basically he was going to stay there in the embassy. So it actually becomes a problem for the U.S. as well, because he's still in the embassy. So what they eventually broker is the Vatican. They can reach an agreement. The U.S. and the Vatican get together, and the Vatican agrees to recall Mindszenty to Rome to talk with the Pope, and use that as the excuse to get Mindszenty to agree to leave the embassy, and the Hungarians let it happen, and basically Mindszenty goes to Rome. He receives a different position, I think, in Rome. I forget the exact position, but that's how it's finally resolved. Basically, the Hungarians were saying, we'll let him go, but Mindszenty was saying, no, I'm not going into exile. I belong in Hungary. And so the way they got around this, finally brokered agreement, was to have the Vatican recall him. And that's how that was resolved.
The Soviets didn't have an interest in that.
Well, not by that time, not by '69. I don't think. I think it was just an embarrassment for everybody by that point, except maybe the cardinal.
Thank you. Hope Harrison, George Washington University. Sounds like a great volume. I have two questions. One is a direct follow-up on Goshka's. I mean, I'm with you all the way. I kept wondering why neither of you said much about China, especially when you were talking about how they hit it off so well in May in Moscow. Meanwhile, Nixon's gone to China, Kissinger's gone. I mean, so I was just wondering how that came in. I mean, I too wondered what were Nixon and Kissinger telling the Chinese, but also sort of how much is that in the volume, because that broader context is just so important, I think. And then secondly, about Kissinger's approach to Basket 3. Doug, you were so critical of him on that, and I felt like part of your attitude was very much sort of hindsight is 20/20. I mean, at the time, he was totally justified in thinking, this is going to be nothing. The Soviets, the East Europeans and the Soviets aren't going to implement this. I mean, let's sign it, but they're not going to do it. So, I mean, I guess I wanted to know more about exactly how you understand Kissinger and Nixon's view of Basket 3. Was it, it's no surprise to any of us that Kissinger didn't care about human rights. So, I mean, was it just that? Was it just that he didn't care and thought this was sort of not important? Or was it that he thought, we're wasting all our time coming up with this language, but they're not going to implement these things that we write? I just sort of like to understand a little bit more about how Kissinger saw it and sort of how you understand Kissinger on this. And also, whose idea was it initially to include all these human rights provisions in Basket 3? Thank you.
Okay. Well, on the Chinese question, I mean, this volume doesn't deal directly with the issue because, this is a documentary series. So there are volumes on the Moscow Summit on the Soviet Union, 69 to 70, 70 to 71, Moscow Summit, the volumes on China, and they deal with that issue in more detail. But certainly, China is playing a role in terms of the Soviet policy. They want to secure their flank in Europe through this European Security Conference in part, by having the West recognize the existing borders, and that's always in the background. And in all the negotiations, that's certainly in the background. Now, in terms of Kissinger and Basket 3, I guess my only criticism is to the extent that in Volume 3 of his memoirs, Kissinger takes credit for Basket 3. It does seem somewhat ironic that we see this consistent position where he's saying, well, it's not really that important. I mean, certainly later on he pushes for a resolution of Basket 3. The U.S. even brings up certain aspects of Basket 3, saying, well, exchange of journalists, this is something we can back up. This is one thing we do.
Why did he say it wasn't important? That's my question. Why did he say it wasn't important? Because he didn't care about it, or because he didn't think it was realistic to expect that it would be implemented?
Both, because if you look at Kissinger's attitude towards international relations, that plays a key role here. For example, we're talking about the issue of Eastern Europe. What some of the West Europeans were hoping to do was through human rights and human contacts to loosen the Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, perhaps ameliorate tensions, and maybe even someday, break up the Soviet sphere of influence. And Kissinger's consistent policy, and Sonnenfeld as well, their attitude is these sort of movements from below, they never work out. Look at Hungary in 1956. Look at East Germany in 1953. Look at the Prague Spring in 1968. If you're talking about using human contacts to promote change in Eastern Europe, all you're going to do is you're basically provoking people to engage in these uprisings eventually, and they're always put down by brute Soviet military force. So if you look at the Kissinger-Sonnenfeld policy towards Eastern Europe, their basic way of looking at it was, their goal in terms of CSCE was to say, well, we want to make sure that the Brezhnev doctrine is not confirmed. One thing that ends up being stressed in CSCE is the sovereignty of each state. And their model for change in Eastern Europe is they want all the East European countries to become more like Romania, which was disobeying the Soviet Union in foreign policy, was sort of going its own path. And they hoped that by improving things like trade between governments, by improving relations between the U.S. government and the communist government in Poland, the communist government in Hungary, that over the long term, through economic contacts, these states would reassert their sovereignty, again in keeping with Kissinger's realist view of the world, and they as states would eventually break away from the Soviet Union. This turns out, however, not to be the case because, well, there's a number of different reasons. One reason is because he's assuming that these communist states in Eastern Europe will want to assert their own sovereignty, which is unclear. Secondly, that if they asserted their sovereignty, this meant that they would follow a different path in the Soviet Union. But Gierek in Poland, whom they had many hopes in, for example, he was definitely a communist, and he really didn't want to break away from the Soviet Union. The same is true of Kadar in Hungary. They believed in communism. They were real communists. They wanted to maintain the communist system. So why, if they got greater sovereignty, would they give up on communism? That's the only reason they're in power. So, and if we look at what actually happens, it's actually the bankruptcy of the sovereignty of, let's say, Poland later on, when, they borrow all this money from the West thanks to détente. They try to implement this policy of consumer communism, of, using these Western loans to, give more food to the people, to give more products to their people, to get them to support the communist regime. That breaks down because they can't pay off the loans. And then it's solidarity later on in the 80s that brings up the issue of human rights again. And it's these human rights activists who start to really undermine the Soviet sphere of influence. It's not because all of a sudden Poland decides it wants to be like Ceausescu or Hungary decides to be like Ceausescu. Basically, the whole bet of Sonnenfeld and Kissinger of these states reasserting their sovereignty turns out to be completely wrong. So that's why I think that, on the human rights issue, Kissinger was consistent about saying, well, he was very suspicious of this idea of undermining the sovereignty of governments by encouraging pressure from below. In fact, it just didn't fit within his realist framework of the world. And I think if you read Jeremy Surrey's recent biography, I think he takes a similar approach. He's very suspicious of mass social movements. He prefers to work state to state.
Actually, if I can follow up with a question of my own. You talked a lot, and you both did, as a matter of fact, of Western Europeans taking initiative, having agency in terms of moving the policy forward. And I was wondering how much the documents, both on the U.S. side in the volume and also on the Russian side, show the agency of Eastern European states in promoting certain ideas that they might have that may or may not differ from the Soviet Union. Generally speaking, I think that most Eastern European states were pretty much in line with the Soviet policy, Romania being a little bit more vocal than many others. But, were there points where, let's say Poland or East Germany or Hungary, pushed the Soviets in a particular direction versus another?
Well, I can talk about Romania and the U.S. Certainly, the Romanian diplomats and, Ceausescu, when he was speaking with Nixon, they always stressed that for them, CSC was important because they wanted provisions in there that, in effect, stressed the sovereignty of all states in Europe, the equal sovereignty of all states, and also this issue of, basically the Brezhnev doctrine should be negated, this idea of you can intervene militarily in another country. They wanted to have some provisions in there to prevent that. And even this issue of troop maneuvers could play into that. So at least, before the Soviets invade, you get a warning. So the Romanians were very, they were saying, we want this European Security Conference. We know the reason the Soviets want it is they want the West to recognize their sphere of influence in order to basically keep the states of Eastern Europe trapped in the Soviet bloc. But the reason we want the European Security Conference is it means recognition of our sovereignty, our sovereign equality, and negation of the Brezhnev doctrine. And they wanted language in the CSCE Final Act, and arguably they did eventually get this, that suggested that the Brezhnev doctrine no longer applied. Of course, Brezhnev might have had a different opinion about that, as Kissinger would point out. But still, in that sense, later on, when Sonnenfeld within the administration wants to defend CSCE, he doesn't talk about Basket 3 and human rights. He says one thing we got out of CSCE is the stressing of the sovereignty of the East European states, and over the long term, as they reassert their sovereignty, which is something we can support, that will, in effect, undermine Soviet control in Eastern Europe.
I would just add that the substance of Basket 3 and the initiatives, human rights initiatives of Basket 3 were all, they all originated in Europe. And what kind of struck me in this volume is how much this is about managing the allies, and how Kissinger, both domestically, internally, in the meetings with his staff and also with the Soviets, makes it very explicit that the Europeans want this. We cannot look as if we don't support our allies on this third basket. In fact, we don't need it at all. He tells the Soviets that the European allies, our European allies, need some substance for their domestic purposes. But the Soviets early on were hoping to actually use the Allies to put pressure very early on in the late 60s, mid to late 60s, beginning with France, Soviet-French dialogue. They were hoping that France would be an instrument to get the United States to commit to CSC and to do it seriously. And the fact that the initial proposals, the Soviet proposals for CSC, did not include the United States did not mean that the Soviets actually did not want to include the United States. They wanted, but they wanted the United States to get sufficiently interested because they created this vision, this reality where they would work with the U.S. allies, get them interested in the conference, and the United States will be outside. So the U.S. would want to come in, and that would make the U.S. more flexible and more willing to compromise. And that was very successful, actually, with France. And Kissinger, in many places, says that the European allies are all running ahead of each other to, get through to the Soviets. And then at one point, he also asks, when they discuss the final meeting of the process to sign the final act, he says, "Who will be the first to sell out to the Soviets? Probably the French." But what is important also is that at the very last stage in the negotiations, the human rights provisions are actually negotiated by the Soviet Union with French, and the specific language is worked out with the Europeans. So I would say that allies were extremely, extremely important. The Europeans were extremely important in suggesting third basket, in writing the language, in pressuring the Soviets and the United States to be serious about it. And if not for that pressure, I don't think there would be a third basket.
Yeah, and I would say that the U.S. did play an important role in Basket 3 at 2 points. Basically, studies within NATO about a potential European Security Conference had begun already before the Nixon administration came into office. I mean, this had started already. There were Soviet proposals since, you can go back to the Warsaw Pact. Actually, that was the original Soviet proposal for a European Security Conference. So within NATO, the bureaucratic steamroller Sonnenfeld's talking about is that in 1968 and 69, the NATO countries, the diplomats at NATO headquarters had already been negotiating, and the U.S. diplomats actually played an important role in pushing the idea of freer movement of people, information, and ideas. And so that's really when the U.S. did play an important role in putting what became Basket 3 together. But later on, because of the Kissinger-Sonnenfeld-Nixon policy, the U.S. became less actively involved in that. But the U.S. diplomats in these various negotiations, they basically went along with the West Europeans. And in fact, some of them have said that one thing they did was not to report everything that was happening back to Washington so that Sonnenfeld couldn't stop the bureaucratic steamroller. And another important aspect of all this, I think, too, is that in effect, Kissinger was like a Trojan horse. I mean, he got the Soviets to accept Basket 3, and he was very convincing in getting them to accept Basket 3 by convincing Gromyko, this is completely worthless, we're not going to bother you about it. but this was inadvertent. It's not something we can later on come along and say, I need to take credit for this because I got the Soviets to accept it, and Basket 3 brought about the downfall of the Soviet Empire. The reason he was so convincing is because he believed it, right? And this is one of those ironies of history, if you will, that he was such a convincing advocate for Basket 3 by convincing the Soviets it was completely worthless.
Max Guderzo, University of Florence. It's still on transatlantic relations. I see there's a kind of red thread connecting 1971 and the end of Bretton Woods, 73, Year of Europe, 73, 75, the Conference on Security in Europe. A thread in the way the European allies were kind of having a specific perception of what the United States was doing, how the United States was supporting its own national interest in a new kind of somewhat unilateral approach to foreign relations. My question is about the U.S. perception of this. That is, was the American leadership, according to the documents you've been through, aware of the fact that, at least in an interpretive assertion we may advance, European allies were reacting to the U.S. attitude in Helsinki while elaborating a kind of common foreign policy in Helsinki. There was actually these 9 acting together. That was not the first time. There were 6 acting together at the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade negotiations before, but actually Helsinki was the first time that the 9 were really doing something together. Was this in the awareness of the American leadership, not only Nixon, Kissinger, also Sonnenfeld and the others? Did they think that this was not a real threat, in the sense that, this was part of a general underestimation of what things were going on and so on? And, do you feel that afterwards they reacted to this reaction?
Well, certainly, I guess this brings us back to the conversation with Luxembourg's foreign minister, Thorn, which, Kissinger, I think, when he was meeting with him, he was sort of, this is the Luxembourg's foreign minister, so what's the big deal? So he basically, attacks, the Europeans when he's talking to Thorn about, MBFR, about bringing in Hungary, and how the U.S. doesn't want to bring in Italy, and how the Europeans are creating all these problems. And later on what happens is that the chief U.S. negotiator at CSCE, Vest, reports back to one of his friends in the State Department, Walt Stossel, about what's going on. And there's a memo about that in here, and he's talking about, now I get to see how the West Europeans see us. I don't know if I need to read through the document or not. Probably I better not, but let's see, what page was that on? But there is this reply to the Thorn situation where Vest brings up the fact that the West Europeans see the U.S. as sort of badgering them, that this issue of Hungary is really a substantive issue for them. Kissinger apparently made some comment about the Dutch negotiator at the MBFR talks, Quarles, saying he should be pulled. That's not in the U.S. MemCon, but apparently he said it because that's what Thorn told people when he went back home about what the U.S. was saying. And Quarles was an old friend of Thorn's, and basically it got around NATO circles, and this engendered more and more resistance from the West European allies, saying, we have to have a united front on these issues, or else, we don't want Kissinger steamrolling us. And there's this constant fear of a condominium, that there's this idea that the U.S. and the Soviet Union are sitting down negotiating behind the Europeans' backs. For example, this deal on the starting date for MBFR talks, trading it for starting date on CSCE. There's this perception that the U.S. and the Soviets have already agreed on the issue of Hungary and Italy behind their backs. And this is what Kissinger actually gets angry about, and is yelling at Thorne about, is saying, the only agreement we had with the Soviets was about the date to start MBFR talks, which is something he hadn't told the Europeans about before. So this is more proof to them, actually he is talking behind our backs. And then there was the issue of the Finnish initiative, Country X, and they sort of saw through that as well. And certainly I would say that in the CSCE process, you see more of this European identity growing and resisting Kissinger's demands to, finish off this basket 3 crap and move forward. Finally you start seeing more of a unified position, in a sense, in resisting this pressure from the U.S. to move things forward quickly.
Well, I guess this is it then. If you guys want to say a couple of closing comments, it'd be good. If not, we'll just adjourn for.
I think I've already said enough.
I just want to add a little comment. In addition to this volume being a terrific source for all of us, I think what it also is a possibility for the Russian scholars to see these documents, because these documents are closed in Russia. There is no access to them, and the publication of a volume like this means that they also can now look at what their representatives said and how this condominium or close cooperation worked, and it makes it even more valuable.